have your phone, is it?
Yeah, I do have my phone with me. Are you ready? Sure.
Thanks for joining us today. This is Debating the Global. In this series of the Center for Modern Turkish Studies, we are discussing the issues which is relating to the global effects on the global level. That proves so that we especially focusing on the policies, foreign policies of the countries, or how it's impacted on the global issues from climate change to wars, especially with the Arab Spring period. We are mostly focused on the Arab Spring developments, but today we have another important issue of the Middle East and the North African issues, which is somehow related with it, the Iraqi case. Then focusing on the Iraqi case and the new developments in terms of the privatization of warfare, which is a new issue in the studies of the war studies. We will try to understand the privatization of warfare, the usage of the legionnaire. Let's say it's more than a legionnaire, I think, so that it's going to be. It's not always in history we have the legionnaires in the different armies that the Greeks or Roman empires or the Seljuks, they already used remember to the history of the caravans, which they have created. Legionnaires created some empires as well. But now that we have different version of warfare, especially in the context of Middle East, then the new legionnaires, new let's say, to privatization of warfare, turning into different engines. Today, to discuss this topic of privatization of warfare with the companies, the military companies, and then specifically their actions in Iraq, the Iraqi invasion and onwards. Today we have a special guest, distinguished guest from London, or let's say from Başakşehir. Because when I sent an email to him to say that how can we arrange this transportation, he replied nicely, we know Istanbul, and then how to get from the Başakşehir to there. Then I was surprised, honestly speaking, but it was nice to hear, to host you. Today we have Nيكولاي Due Gundersen. Correctly pronounce it. If not, I'm so sorry. This is my poverty. That's such a poor. That family would be sorry for that. And Mr. Due Gundersen, which was just Due Gundersen, is a PhD candidate at Kingston University as a political commentator. At the same time, to the many outlets. Media outlets that we can see his name if you go several that I've listed some of them. But in London now, after 4 years in the Middle East that he lived, during his time in the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan, he served as an advisor for the Arab Institute for Security Studies and worked with various NGOs. He is author of the books which is called as today's title as the Privatization of Warfare, military companies in Iraq that he will present with his studies. And his works will appear on many journals, well-known journals, including Open Democracy, The Small Wars, Journal of Conversation and Oil and Gas Energy. And frequently that he was a media commentator of Al Jazeera, and voice of Islam radio and radio Sputnik. And he speaks Arabic fluently, and he will speak about his book and process.
Yeah, and today I'll speak about my book in English, not Arabic. But anyway, thank you for that wonderful introduction, and it's a pleasure to be here at your institute. So today I'm going to be talking about private military companies. And it's almost a contradiction in terms, because we're talking about political actors that are not states, that are ultimately private corporations, but that have a lot of power and influence in countries like Iraq, where the law is quite weak. So, looking at the book cover, for example, I chose this image of a soldier with a rifle and with a price tag on the rifle. And I chose this on purpose to symbolize the idea that warfare is becoming increasingly for profit. Increasingly, it's a market. And we're going to look at that a bit today. So firstly, I will introduce what are private military companies, where do they come from, okay? I will talk about the case studies I used in my book, which are the Abu Ghraib prison scandal and what's called the Sehir Square massacre, which both happened in Iraq. And I will also talk about certain documents under international law that are used to try to address the issue of private military companies, before I also try to talk about how the state defines legitimacy and how it has a relationship with private military companies. How is that relationship legitimate or not? How does the general public perceive that relationship as well? So firstly, I think it's very interesting to understand that although most of the case studies you would have heard about from CNN, BBC are about American private military companies, over half of private military companies are actually European, not American. And I found that very interesting. And when we use the term private military company, we're not just talking about companies in Iraq, we're also talking about companies that have security. We're talking about companies that could, for example, be hired to guard a mall or a bank. So you see, it's a very broad term. It's not just about being in the Middle East or being in Iraq and on the ground as soldiers. At the same time, Iraq and Afghanistan have been the most profitable areas, most profitable, to be frank with you, the most profitable markets for these companies. From 2007 to 12, there were almost $200 billion worth of contracts in these two countries alone for private military companies. And this is why it's such a hot topic, because there's so much money being made by these companies, and at the same time states are using them more and more. And so we start to ask ourselves, as researchers, and all of us in this room are researchers, we have to ask ourselves, what exactly are these companies doing? Is it legal or illegal? Most of the tasks that PMCs engage in may not necessarily involve carrying a gun or being armed. In fact, some of the tasks are protection, maintaining systems for the army, logistics, if you like, administrative. There will be some armed security, of course, and this is one of the problems, whether or not private military companies, their staff, can they be armed, can they carry guns? So when I'm trying to look at what PMCs are, how they operate, I turn to these two case studies. I look at Abu Ghraib and the Sehir Square. So to the left here, this is Abu Ghraib prison in Baghdad. There's one of the walls here, okay? Now this prison was used by Saddam Hussein until he was overthrown. And after that, US forces captured it and they started to use it as their own prison. To the right here is Blackwater. I'm sure all of you have heard of Blackwater, most of you would have heard of them. They are a private military company, still operating, but they've changed their name at least twice. So, looking at Abu Ghraib and the prison scandals going back to 2003, despite the fact that the abuses happened in late 2003, the prison continued to operate until 2014. That's crazy. That's only a few years ago. It's 4 years ago that the prison was closed. Now, what I found interesting about this case is the fact that there were photos taken mainly by US military personnel showing them abusing prisoners. And what happened was that we did have international outrage across the Middle East, but more interestingly, from some of my sources in Iraq, I found out that there was like a Baghdad street market where they would sell DVDs and stuff like that. So the photos found their way onto that market. And this is important because it means that ordinary local people in Iraq could buy these CD-ROMs with the photos of abuse and see firsthand all these terrible photos of what happened. So of course it led to a lot of outrage. And it's with this case especially that people started asking, okay, who exactly is in Iraq? The Americans? Okay, fine, the American military, fine, but who else? What are they doing on the ground? So we have a focus on the US military that perpetrated these crimes, but also private companies, military staff, like so PMC employees. Now, according to Don Rumsfeld, who at the time was the defense secretary, he claims that there were only 37 contractors at the prison. So in other words, there were more military forces who participated in abuses than private contractors. But nonetheless, there was a lot of focus on the contractors and their responsibility. So there are two companies that were involved. The first is called Casey. They supplied most of the interrogators. And again, when I look at what you need to do is, when you look at why these companies got involved in the first place, look at the relationship they had with the US government. This is usually why they got contracts in the first place. Casey was a company that got a lot of weapons contracts during the Cold War. When the Cold War came to an end, they wanted to diversify and go into other sectors, so they went into IT. And one of the things that they did, which was one of the problems I found, was intelligence gathering, both open and closed. In other words, they got contracts to gather intelligence for the US government that could be from Wikipedia, it could be from Google, and they just compile it nicely and present it to the government. Here you go, this is what you asked for, that's open information. They were also in charge of gathering closed or classified information. And this is a problem, open and closed information. So how they got this information was very vague. In the contracts with the US government for Abu Ghraib, it was never specified how they would get this information. All the contract said was that Casey is in charge of human intelligence. That doesn't tell us anything. It doesn't tell us whether that intelligence comes from torture. It doesn't tell us whether the intelligence comes through illegal means or not. The second company that was involved in these abuses was called Tightening, and they have since folded. They were also a company that had relations with the US government that diversified through IT systems and intelligence gathering. And what I find interesting is that after the Abu Ghraib scandal broke, they still got contracts with the US government. It was as if they could just try to forget about what happened. So they supplied contract, 4,500 translators to Iraq after the Abu Ghraib scandal. So despite the fact that this happened to them and there was a lot of public pressure, they were still doing business with the government. At the same time, while Casey are still around, this is the last time I checked, these guys, Tightening, they lost a major deal with Lockheed Martin. Lockheed Martin are a massive, massive aero defense firm. You might have heard of them. They're huge. And when this scandal broke, they said, okay, we're not going to merge with Tightening because there's so much pressure, public, heat, we're not going to do it. So Tightening lost their merger and eventually they folded. This case study here is a case study that involves solely contractors. Now, I want to ask you all a question. I always do this when I give my book tour. Take a look at this photo, okay? And answer this question. Are these people, would you call them soldiers or employees? Anybody, tell me. You say employees. Anyone else? Would you say soldier or employee?
Looks like more employee than soldiers.
Why do you say that?
And the images that they give the impression that because soldiers are different than the fancy sunglasses.
Okay, that's a very good observation. In fact, you're the first person to say that when I've given this lecture. Most people say soldiers, but you are actually correct. You gave the right answer because they are not soldiers. This is the point. You look at the way they're dressed. I mean, they have, some of them they have a gun mounted here on the truck behind them. They're wearing what could look like uniforms, except no name tag, no country, no nationality of any kind, no affiliation with any military. And this is the point. They're not soldiers, but a lot of people would mistake them for soldiers. And that is the image of the mercenary, a person who is paid to fight for money and who carries a gun who should not. That is that image. And that is a huge part of the private military company scandal, is exactly that. So if we look at Blackwater's involvement in the Suez Square in Baghdad, they were accused and found guilty of killing up to 17 unarmed civilians during a traffic incident. And one of the differences, as I mentioned, is the fact that here, with Blackwater, we only have contractors involved. We don't have some contractors and some members of the US military. It's only contractors who were involved. And at the same time, there were no prosecutions, which I found shocking. And I'll talk a bit about that as well. So I don't know if everyone can see this clearly here, but this is meant to be a summary, a timeline of what happened during the event. So just to summarize here, in the morning, a convoy of Blackwater vehicles arrived at an area where there was a bomb that exploded, and there was a traffic jam. One of the staff members tried to get a vehicle in front of him to move, and when it wouldn't, he started firing, and he killed a passenger and a driver. And then the other the other staff members, the other staff members started to fire as well, and this continued. 17 civilians were killed, and then after this event, further Blackwater employees turned up to clear the area. But this is the event that Blackwater is most known for. It's most infamous, that it killed civilians in Iraq. What I tried to investigate with my work and with my book is two things. There's the legal aspect to what happened, and how the United States government reacted to the event, but there's also how the general public reacted, the Arab world, the Muslim world, the Middle East, the West. How did ordinary people like you and I, how did we react to these events? Now, it's quite sad, but this event happened in 2007. In 2009, the case against the employees was dismissed due to so-called tampered evidence. So a judge in the US argued that the prosecution had tampered with evidence to try to make it more convincing, so the case was dismissed on a technicality. In Iraq, Iraq's reaction was very symbolic, more symbolic than physical or of substance. They withdrew Blackwater's license to operate in Iraq, but by that time the license itself had already expired. So it was kind of a moot point. They did it just it was symbolic. At this time, we are seeing more and more literature on private military companies in general. We're seeing the rise of criticism and people asking, what do these companies do? Why are they in Iraq? How much money are they making and for what? One of the things that I've observed in speaking to people, including some in the industry, is whether or not international law, and I think that's something related to international relations, whether it can actually be used to control corporations. Because again, I keep stressing this over and over, these guys, they are private companies, and when a private company gets too big in a state that's weak, it can become as powerful as a statehood, and this is a problem. So there are some authors like E.L. Gaston, who I highly recommend. He wrote for Harvard Law Review an article arguing that we need to change international law, that we actually need to have norms or regulation under international law for private military companies, specifically. At the same time, I found from my work that in order to have effective regulation, you need to involve the industry. Private military companies themselves have to be interested in getting involved. But the problem is, if they're going to get involved, they want regulation to be voluntary, and that means that regulation will not be as effective as it could be. One of the documents that I looked at under international law specifically is the Montreux document. This is a document that Iraq and the US has tried to implement that tries to address the issue of private military companies under international law. So what are the main points why do we have this document at all? The main reason we have the Montreux document is to determine what tasks private military companies are allowed to do. What do we allow them to do in Iraq or in, Colombia or Libya or anywhere else? What should they be allowed to do or not? It also argues that private military companies need oversight. This is the main point. What the Suez Square and Abu Ghraib showed us is that when you have a lack of accountability, Murders can happen, abuses can happen, and that has to be stopped. You need accountability. And so this is the whole point of the document, to argue that private military companies need to be licensed. Wherever they operate, there has to be a license that they are granted, which means that they fit specific criteria so that they're safe and that they can operate in the country. Also, the vetting of staff. This is very important because this is also very weak. So, if I want to work for Blackwater, in theory, Blackwater shouldn't just hire me because I've got the skills. They should say, okay, let's have a look at this guy. Does he have criminal convictions? Has he ever been found guilty of anything? And that has not happened. There have been issues where, or incidents where, for example, former employees of Blackwater and other companies that were on the verge of being found guilty of murder or abuse or whatever, they've left Iraq, they're American, okay? They leave Iraq, go back to America for a few months, come back to Iraq, and they find employment with another company. And that says something, because it means that these companies, they need people, and they are willing to look the other way. So, the United States has tried to implement the Montreux document to a point. But one of the issues that we have here is that the Montreux document is not stating anything new. It is not changing international law. All it is doing is restating current commitments. In other words, that states are responsible for international law. States must observe what their people do abroad, what their companies do abroad. It doesn't give us a new law specifically for private military companies. And this is a problem. And the reason the US is so important is not just because of the incidents that we discussed earlier. It's also because the US is what's called a home and contracting state. What that means is that the United States has American companies that are sent abroad, to Libya and to Iraq. But it also hires companies as well. Those companies could be British, they could be French, and the Americans hire them and then they send them to Iraq or to Libya. And this is a problem because the regulation we have under US law is very weak. The strongest law that I can find in my work is a military law called the Military Extraterritorial Judicial Act, or MAJA for short. And what this law claims is that if you are a member of the US Armed Forces and you commit a crime abroad, you will be prosecuted back home. So the idea behind it is interesting, that if I am a soldier and I commit an offense in Iraq that would be punishable back in the States, I will be prosecuted. So the idea behind that is good, but the problem is this applies to the military, not to private companies, not to staff members. Yes, please.
When was came to
It's quite now it's quite old. It's
in the
been
1950s, that was one of the cases in Turkey,
yes.
especially with the American soldiers
Yeah.
killing the farmers in Adana and Sehir. They faced it, but they are prosecuted.
Yeah. Is
I
this
think
also?
1960s, maybe.
Oh, yeah.
Because 1950s, we don't have such kind of responsibility for the militaries that they were so free yet.
Yeah. No, you're quite right. No, it's not a very, very new law, but the context is new. So talking about it in the context of private military companies is new. But how effective or not it is, that's another story.
This is just only for the American soldiers.
Yes, exactly. That's also part of the problem. Because you have now, it's very multi-layered, right? You have U.S. soldiers abroad who could be prosecuted under this.
Well, I mean,
right?
actually, I work for the organized crime drug trafficking.
Okay.
And in the Bosnian case, for example, maybe you also watched the Whistleblower, which is a real story about the American soldiers.
Yeah.
They're committing the woman trafficking.
Yes.
And there were drug trafficking in Bosnia and Kosovo, which is all around. But I didn't see I didn't read any prosecution.
That's also been a problem.
Because there is a law, but is that implemented?
Well, this is one of the problems when you have a law where there's gaps and it's not effective enough. And I'll talk a bit about that in a second. But one of the problems is, for example, I would argue that it's not just about the people who commit the offense. Let's say if you have a group of soldiers, that group will have a commander. So the commander should know what's going on with his battalion. So if 2 soldiers from his command commit an offense, he should also be prosecuted. And this is part of the problem that, there's a lack of prosecution. Sometimes things they take years to go to court and to go through trial, and by then, if it takes too long, for example, think worst case scenario. What if a case takes so long that elderly victims are dead, for example? There's all sorts of things that could happen. But on top of that, the regulation itself has to be changed for private military companies as well. But in general, yes, I've seen a lack of prosecution in these cases, even with the US military. So you're quite right. That's a very good point. And in Iraq as well, for the Montreux document, a territorial state, what this means is simply that Iraq is a country where private military companies come to operate. You see? So if you have an American private military company and they are sent to Iraq, Iraq hosts those companies. They are operating on Iraqi soil. And what we saw after the invasion was an increasing use of private military companies in Iraq. In fact, one of the most shocking things I found was the fact that when it was confirmed that US forces were going to go into Baghdad and into Iraq, some private military firms, they sprang up overnight. Like literally, we had like a retired US colonel who still had contacts in Iraq. He formed a company. He got, printed out the paper, called his contacts in Iraq and said, listen, I'm starting a company to put US boots on the ground. This is very, very shocking because it means, where's the accountability? Where's the regulation? You see? Another problem for Iraq is just, it's politically not stable. Its governance is very weak. And what I've seen with PMCs that come into the country is that there's the fear that they will get politically involved. So, for example, I've written here political involvement in tribes. There have been some cases where private military companies have negotiated with tribes in certain areas in Iraq and paid them for safety, for access to certain things, which is something that the government should be in charge of, not a private company. So this is shocking that they've gone this far. And I also wrote an article, which I've used in the book to a point, about the Iraqi oil law. And what this is simply the fact that in Iraq, although the country is not very stable, there's still a lot of oil, and it is very cheap to extract that oil compared to other countries. So what Iraq is afraid of is that private military firms, and of course they can represent national interests. An American private military company can represent American interests indirectly. But they will come in, they'll guard the oil fields, and they will start to take over step by step. They will start to weaken Iraq's control over its oil fields. And so they passed a law, I believe in 2013, where they said private military companies cannot guard oil infrastructure. We will have our own oil police specifically for that. And they created oil police. The problem is the oil police are understaffed. So they don't have enough people to staff that section of their government, but they did it to make the point that we don't want private corporations from France and from the UK and from the US, from the coalition of the willing, if you like, guarding our oil, because we know what's going to happen. And the lack of coordination is an issue, because with a Montreux document, for any regulation to work, you need cooperation and coordination across the globe, and you're not getting that because Iraq is too weak to be able to enforce its own laws. So it's not strong enough to be able to prosecute PMCs or to deal with them when something goes wrong. So in my work, what I've tried to do is I've tried to ask myself, okay, how can governments justify using private military companies in the eyes of the public and to themselves? And so I've come up with, using Fabian Picher, I've looked at social contract theory, which I'm also doing for my thesis. So the idea of a social contract is that you have an agreement between the state and your citizens. So, for example, imagine the Gulf or wealthy oil kingdoms. In the Gulf, citizens could recognize a king's right to rule and that they don't have a political say in exchange for welfare benefits, free apartments, free housing, free education, and so on and so forth. That is a social contract. It's a ruling bargain, what we call. So the social contract itself can consist of several things. Firstly, there has to be the consent to be ruled. That I agree, as a citizen of, say, the Emirates, I agree to be ruled by a particular emir in exchange for beneficial consequences. In other words, in exchange for welfare, cheaper housing, cheap transportation, but even safety. And this is the scary part, because with private military companies, safety itself becomes a product, you see? And in Iraq, you're only as safe as the company you can afford to pay for. And this is the problem. So, the final term here is a bit misleading, democratic approval. What this means is simply that a government has a parliament and that they make decisions through that parliament. doesn't mean that the people have a say on major issues. So a country, a state, can argue that, okay, in exchange for ruling you, we will provide you with safety. We decide how to provide that safety. So if we decide to have private military companies, and we had a debate in Parliament about that, like that's it, you don't get to have a say in how we rule you or how we provide safety as long as you agree to being ruled by us. So this is one way that states can try to make the PMC framework fit, how military companies can be used by the state and they can try to justify it. So I tried to also look in the book at how the general public perceives private military firms. And what I did was I analyzed media outlets from the Arab world, the Middle East, British and US as well, on these case studies, Abu Ghraib and Nisr Square. What does the media say about these companies? What do they call them? What I found very interesting and surprising is that I've been using this term, private military companies, for this lecture. Most headlines with the BBC, Al Jazeera and others, they call them security firms, not military firms. And this is interesting because this is a term that PMCs prefer. They don't like being called military companies. They prefer the term security company because it's nicer. It sounds like it's about protection. Exactly. So it's very interesting that they have used this, and the media picked up on this kind of rhetoric and started to call them private security companies. They did so, however, in a negative context. So, for example, BBC had headlines like, private security company kills 17 civilians. Private security company accused of abuse in Abu Ghraib. So in a sense it was a bit ironic that they used the term security, but I found it interesting. The exception to this was CNN. Some of their headlines did use the term private military company instead of security. I found that very interesting because they're a US network. And they call US companies private military companies, not security. That was very interesting. Yeah, sorry, please.
Security firms that very, which is the private security firms that very unusual, especially in modern times.
Yeah.
The protections of the buildings.
Yeah.
And it creates more positive.
Exactly, but that's a very good point.
Maybe society will more passive perception.
Exactly. In fact, some of the European companies I mentioned earlier, they do both. They are private security companies that are of European origin. Some of them are so big that they have operations in Iraq and they're doing things that, like what Blackwater was doing, but they also have operations in Europe where they got acquire malls.
Call this a security firm or?
I'll get to that in a second. It's very interesting. It'll come at the end. So for Abu Ghraib, what I found is that they were consistently called US corporations. And the reason I found this interesting is because by calling them corporations, you are acknowledging that they are private companies, they are not state actors, but they are non-state political actors. And at the same time, you are arguing that by calling them a US company, when something goes wrong, such as with Abu Ghraib, the public expects the United States government to step in. You see? So the buck stops with them. In other words, it is the United States that's responsible for how its companies behave abroad. And if there's a violation, people expect the US to rectify that violation or to punish these companies. At the same time, and this is kind of disturbing, but with the BBC I found something different. There was a settlement for the Abu Ghraib abuses out of court. So the victims, some of them they sued. They went to court, they tried to sue, and they were compensated. It was settled out of court, and when that happened, I noticed that the BBC, they started to call Casey, instead of calling them a US corporation, they started to call them a defense contractor again. So it's like, they bought back their legitimacy. It's like, they wanted to be seen as a defense contractor, like private security firm. When the abuses started, the press began to call Casey US corporations, but after they settled out of court, now they're suddenly a defense contractor again. So it's like they're buying back their legitimacy. So it leads to a lot of questions about state versus corporate responsibility. The general public seems to argue that states are responsible for how their companies behave abroad, rather than companies themselves, which is interesting. So as we were discussing earlier, private military firms do usually try to construct themselves as security firms, protective. In fact, some of the voluntary documents that they've tried to get involved in for regulation private military companies have refused to sign those documents unless they're referred to as security companies. They do not like the term military. So the image of security, of course, when you have the upper-grade abuses, when you have this sort of scandal, of course, people, they sit up, they pay attention, they notice these things. But when this happens, usually the public turns to the state of that company. So if it's a US company, it is the United States government that is responsible for punishing these companies and rectifying any wrongdoing. So what I found that's quite interesting is that the general public does not have an issue with states using private military companies. What they have an issue with is if those states do not discipline private military companies and do not take them to court or punish them for wrongdoing. And as I mentioned earlier, the use of settlement to try to buy back legitimacy. So it's quite disturbing as well. With the Abu Ghraib abuses, we're talking about abuses, not murder. That's part of it. But at the same time, when this happened, Casey, they settled out of court and suddenly they're a defense contractor again, instead of being seen as a US corporation or private military company. I will mention, regarding Blackwater, seeing as you asked, up until about 2011, they used the term private security company. After 2012, when I was on their website, and I put this in the book, they started to use the term private military company. I found that very interesting. So they actually tried to use an aggressive image. They did not refer to the Nisour Square incident, but they did say things on their website like, we have operated in hostile zones like Iraq. We operate missions in Iraq. Very aggressive language. I found that very surprising, because you would think that they wanted to downplay, but they didn't. So thank you very much for your time, and hope that it was helpful.
Thank you. Now, actually, I do not want to make the short, let's say, summary of it, but the conclusion is very clear today. It was a very, let's say, thought-provoking things. Then now, Q&A session, please. Questions and comments are welcome.
Yeah,
Well, thank you very much for this very interesting talk. Out of curiosity, towards the very end, one of the things you highlighted, if I'm not mistaken, was that public perceives these private military companies as, in a way, extensions of states and therefore need to be held accountable by the states.
Yeah.
Can I please ask how you measured the public opinion on that?
Well, what I did was, in my research for the book, I did rhetorical analysis. So what I've done to make it less complex so that the results are easier to measure, I've looked at media rhetoric. I have not interviewed people or anything like that. I've here assumed that the media represents sort of, how the general public perceives these companies. So I've looked at, for example, the headlines that were published by the BBC, by Al Jazeera, by CNN regarding these wrongdoings and how they labeled the companies. Do they use the term private military company? Do they use the term private security company? This is how I try to figure out, what is the image of the companies. When I look at state legitimacy and the connection, the relationship between private military companies and states, what I try to do is I try to look at what I call ownership. So, for example, if we're looking at what happened at Abu Ghraib, Nisour Square, say Blackwater, does the headline or the series of headlines, do they call Blackwater a private military firm, or do they call them an American private military firm or a US private military firm? When they use the term American or US, I find that very interesting because it denotes nationality, and it denotes to me a relationship between the company and the country it's from. So a relationship with the state and with the government. This is how I try to see things.
Any other questions, comments? Thank you very much. Thanks. Actually, my question is about the most theoretical part of the issue. Is about justice. Look everywhere in the justice. And the PMCs, the private military companies. Do you think that there are just means, just instruments?
That's a very good question. I think that they are cost-effective instruments, which is not the same. But the main reason you find military companies being used is because they are seen two things. They are seen as cost-effective by the states that use them, and there's also, after the Cold War, budgets, defense budgets, especially in states were slashed. So they said, okay, how can we have operations abroad, but where it costs us money? The answer is private military companies. The other thing, politically, is that there's, the image of dead soldiers being brought home is not an image that the general public in the States likes. But when it's staff members from a company, it's very quiet. In fact, when I was lecturing in Izmir, and one student, he mentioned something interesting. He said that there had recently been a skirmish in Syria involving, a disputed area. It was basically the Russians and the Americans, but that the Americans who were involved were with a security company. And because they were staff members, not soldiers, Russia was not going to make a big deal out of it. Whereas he said to me, if they were US soldiers, the political symbol would be stronger, so Russia might actually hit back. So there's also that politically it is more palatable to have staff members, even if they're American, because they're not soldiers, they're not representing their country in the same way. And that makes a difference to the image that they have. Yeah, please.
If I'm not mistaken, I remember correctly, there was a discussion about this Trump's plan on Afghanistan to reduce the number of soldiers in the United States, in Afghanistan, and increase the these kind of defense contractors or something like that, whatever it is. I mean, I'm really curious about what is Pentagon thinking about this issue? Are they because Pentagon didn't like the idea at the beginning, as far as I know.
Correct.
What do you think about the military's point of view in this?
Oh, so you're not the first person to ask that question, because it's a very strong question. The Pentagon and militaries in general do not look favorably on private military companies. There's actually one thing I forgot to mention in the presentation, the fact that a lot of the staff who are experienced, who are hired by private military companies, are former soldiers, and they are hired because of their military experience. So, for example, you could hire a general, for example, who's been in Iraq God knows how many times, and he's very experienced in fighting in Iraq, and he knows the tribes, he knows the area. And the thing is, you attract him with higher pay. And what the military in the US and in the UK, what they don't like is the fact that, you spend time and money training soldiers, and then at some point a PMC could come by and say, we'll pay you more. And so you see this drain on the armed forces that could happen, where soldiers who have experience and who are good at what they do, if you like, are snapped up by private military companies willing to pay more. In fact, I had an interview 2 years ago with a defense college in the UK, and I was looking at their curriculum for how they teach students. It's a military college, and I said to them, have you considered looking at private military companies? And they didn't like that. They don't like to acknowledge that private military companies exist, because they see them as, they don't have the prestige of the military, but they're also seen as a threat because they could drain resources from the military by taking some of their best staff. Now, at the end of the day, if you're a soldier in any country and you have family to feed and whatnot, for some people, they would take higher pay. So I think that the Pentagon does not like the use of private military companies. I think that anyone associated with the armed forces who is that high up would not like the fact that PMCs are seen as cost effective and that they could be a drain on on your staff or on your soldiers.
Why the PMCs are mostly from Europe? Do you have any?
Why they're mostly from well, I think that
Please pause that. That's why I was just
yeah.
I'm not going about the Europeans is it because of the colonial past that they also?
There's some of that. Yeah, I mean,
in Africa.
Yeah.
In Africa. Do we have any kind of, let's say, which country has most French?
Yeah, I mean,
French, German, British. Do you have any? Let's say, so specifically. I'm just wondering about it. Is there any colonial reach, or let's say the operations they use in Africa, or do you have any information about any knowledge about the PMC's other parts of the world, especially in Africa?
Well, it wouldn't surprise me at all. I mean, there are PMCs operating in Africa. I think, for example, Libya, especially after the unrest there. That would be a new case study that will start to open up. I think to an extent, colonialism, yes, I suppose that could be part of it, and imperialism. That some of the European countries were in these other countries before, And of course, they were in these countries in some cases with private companies. I mean, there wasn't the East India Trading Company, for example, going back to the British Empire, and I believe that they ruled effectively parts of India, and they became so big that the British government shut them down because they were becoming too powerful. So there are colonial links to a point. At the same time, some of the companies are British, and I know that some of them, like there's a G4S, which is a massive European security company. That's one massive company that does not necessarily go into it all. They have a very broad criteria for the things they do. And then there's Control Risks, which is a British company. They're still around. In fact, they're a consulting firm, but there's a few things there. I actually had a friend who had an interview with him a few weeks ago. He didn't get the job.
I worked with them somehow.
Oh, well, there you go. So you're working.
But
Africa, the thing is, the most profitable sites so far remain Iraq and Afghanistan. There's so much money made there that most private military companies they're happy with going there because the profits are solid. I don't think a lot of them would actually want to change and go to Africa or elsewhere. Though as a company, of course, they'd be interested in expanding. You go where the money is. So for Africa, places that are less stable and where there's warfare, they would start to see that. But also places where there's oil. Definitely places where there's oil as well.
oil, like,
Yeah. Yeah, please.
It's such a big market. Why not a country like China?
Why not a country like China? Why they don't get involved?
Yeah.
So that's also a good question. China might, to an extent, get involved. China needs energy growth. So I wouldn't be surprised if they do start to get more involved. They are a rival to the US. They're getting more involved in the Middle East as well. I don't think they like Trump very much. And they are seen as a very fast expanding economy. In fact, I remember one of the arguments, in China, I don't know if you've ever been, but if you go to places like Beijing, Shanghai, it's very polluted. And there's been this argument from European countries that, they should sign the Kyoto Protocol to deal with having cleaner air. And they're saying to us, well, listen, you had a chance to develop your economy further than we did, now it's our turn. And you didn't have all these regulations. And they probably think the same about private military companies, that there are some, not Chinese private military companies, but there are some links to PMCs in Iraq where they would look at doing business, and they would look at getting deals with Iraq as well to get oil. At the same time, I think that China, the way they think is a bit different. China is a country where you have Confucianism to a point, rather than having only capitalism. They're not communist anymore, of course not. They want to make money like anyone else. But certainly, they have criticized the Western model, they criticize Western imperialism, they criticize Western capitalism. For anyone who looks at China and criticizes the way they do things, China would say, well, look at, for example, the 2008 financial crisis and what that led to. China is going to be a major player, and certainly in the Middle East. I mean, they want to get more and more energy because they need to grow. They want to grow as fast as possible. And they're getting involved in the Middle East and also even in the States. Not with PMCs, but in general. No.
Not only China, but the thing is, if it's a market,
Yeah.
and if it's a tool for international relations,
Yeah.
with private military
Yeah,
companies. So the always question comes like China or Russia.
Yeah, Russia.
Why they are not part of it? What is the barrier?
I'm sorry?
What is the barrier that holds them to not execute this particular tool?
Yeah. Well, there are a lot of things that we don't know about. There's a lot of information as a researcher that I've tried to access which I have not been able to get access to because it's classified. That says something, I know with Russia.
Like Russian companies are in Syria, like
Yeah.
recently Wagner, right?
Yeah, that's also very true. Russia, getting involved again, what we were discussing earlier, the idea that if you outsource difficult or violent conflict or operations to a company, the political symbol is lowered because you're not talking about soldiers clashing, you're talking about staff clashing. So it wouldn't surprise me if Russia is doing that. I know also if you've heard of Gazprom, which is a massive Russian energy company, they have their own security. That's like a private military company that they own. It's part of their structure. So for Russia, you have, for example, the Russian state. Okay, they control Gazprom, all right, and then Gazprom, in turn, which is a state-owned company, controls their own security, which is related to oil. That's one thing. The other thing regarding private military companies and energy is that in some cases, what they do, what governments do, or sorry, what the oil companies will do is they will access armed forces instead. So one of the things I looked at in my book was Latin America, places like Ecuador and whatnot. And what I found is that, the state is meant to be responsible for the armed forces, right? So the state is meant to pay soldiers' salary, accommodation, healthcare. So what some oil companies have done is that they've struck a deal with the state where they said, look, if you give us contracts, give us oil contracts, we'll take over paying for your armed forces, and in exchange for that, the armed forces report to us. Okay? So they get the armed forces as their own little, military in a sense, and they then get that military to control the oil fields for them, and also to even, in some cases, depopulate areas where there's oil, but people are already living there. This is more in Latin America than the Middle East. But that's a very interesting case study that I mentioned at the end of the book as well.
The very recent Sehir case is very interesting. An oil guy, I don't know, in Sehir tried to hire this Russian military company, and then U.S. coalition strike the Russian military contractor companies, and there are almost hundreds of Russian how do you say, soldiers or
if you're talking about companies, staff members, but yes.
Staff members died, and now Russia says they are not soldiers.
Well, that's another thing. The problem is that combatant is a legal term.
Legal term.
Yeah. And most staff members do not fit that criteria. This is always, it's shocking to most people when they hear that, but you see, there's several things. You have soldiers, and then you have mercenaries, someone who fights for money. There's a legal definition of what a mercenary is. Most staff members from private military companies would not fit that term. Why? Because it's a 6-point term, and you have to fit all 6 points to be legally classified as a mercenary, and then prosecuted as a mercenary. So most staff members wouldn't fit it. So for example, firstly, you have to prove, the judge or whoever has to prove that you're fighting for money. Okay, that's one. Secondly, you cannot be a member of a party to the conflict. So what does that mean? It means that, for example, imagine if in Libya, you have private military companies and Libya is having a civil war, and a staff member who kills someone else is Libyan. Right there, he's a member of a party to the conflict. You can't prosecute him as a mercenary. And how can you prove that they're there, fighting for money? There's also that. So that it's very complex. Sometimes it seems too complex. It's a problem.
Can you consider that the aim of these companies is just to keep the Iraqi government weak and control the economy?
That would be perhaps a stretch, but I'll tell you this. I think that the United States would not mind if Middle Eastern states were weaker, including Iraq. Why? Because if a state is weak, you can trap them with IMF loans, you can try to extract their oil, you can, bully them into giving concessions. It's not necessarily in the West's interest for these countries to be strong, which is very sad. So I would say that maybe through corporations, there is a bit of that as well. I wouldn't say that private military companies go into Iraq to try to make them weak and prefer if they're weak per se, but if Iraq was stable and safe, would these companies make any money? I don't think they would, because there would be no need for security. If Afghanistan had a stable government and Iraq had a stable government, where's the money for these guys? There is no profit in that.
So can you say they are making the problems to keep the situation back? Nowadays in Anbar, the province next to Jordan, there is a company controlling the gate between Iraq and Jordan, for economic things. There is no, even the Iraqi military have no
say.
Yeah, they can't even do anything.
Well, that's shocking. Well, you see, things like that, that goes to show perhaps how weak the Iraqi government is, which is a problem. There's no profit in peace for these companies, I think, which is very sad to see. That's something to remember. If you're, for example, if you have a private military company and the person's working for that company as a political analyst, that's different, because that person, they analyze the politics on the ground. They don't have to work for a private military company. They can work for an insurance company instead. So that's different. If we're talking about staff members and the company as a whole providing security, which is the main point of the whole company, where's the profit if Iraq can secure itself? You know, where's the profit if Afghanistan can secure itself? You know, there is no profit. No. Yeah,
Last
please.
one.
Last one.
Thank you for interesting topic. Can I ask that why did you want to study that topic? Do you criticize privatization process, or did you feel social responsibility after you observed the field?
Yeah, I mean, to answer your questions, this book came from my master's thesis. Yeah, I mean, are you all doing masters here? BA, masters, PhD? What are you all doing?
I'm only doing my.
You're doing MA, okay. Well, you could publish your MA thesis. You know. So it started as my master's thesis, and then as I did the research, I found it to be very interesting, and I, expanded it to turn it into a monograph or a book. Do I feel social responsibility? I suppose there's, as a person, there's very little you can do physically or politically, but what you can do as a researcher is to make people aware that this exists. I think that that's a good responsibility to take on. We're all scholars, and so you want to make sure that you, when you find things like this, that you publish it, you make people aware of it, you talk about it. I think that is a form of social responsibility. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for joining us. Thank you. Then hopefully tomorrow we will also hosting to Professor Veronica, focusing on the humanitarian issues from a humanitarian perspective, the Latin American case.
Yes. She'll be talking about both current humanitarian issues in Latin America, but she also studies Syrian refugees in Turkey, so she's going to bring two perspectives together.
Tomorrow we are all invited to our talk.
What
It will be at 4 o'clock
Here.
here.